For the past 20 years, SABU has presented its Distinguished Achievement Award to single-out individuals who have made a significant impact on the field of business journalism and who have served as a nurturing influence on others in their profession. It is our highest honor. This year's recipient embodies the best of our business, an individual who has worked in the trenches of business news, created platforms and companies to expand business journalism, mentored hundreds of other journalists throughout their careers, taught the craft of journalism to students, and raised our profession in immeasurable ways. Larry Kramer's bio doesn't even come close to doing his career justice, but I'll read the highlights anyway since they're so darn impressive. Larry is the founder and former CEO of CBS MarketWatch.com. He was the first president of CBS Digital, and he sits or has sat on the boards of Discovery Communications, the American Media, Freedom Communications, Opinions, Black Arrow, and the Harvard Business School Publishing. He's been an adjunct professor at the Newhouse School at Syracuse University and was formerly the editor of the San Francisco Examiner and the assistant managing editor of the Washington Post. He also served as the publisher of USA Today and the chairman and CEO of TheStreet.com. Those are just the highlights. There is so much more, but I want to save the rest for that conversation coming right after this. But the through lines that are run through Larry's career is that he's a journalist, he's an entrepreneur, he's a leader, and he's a visionary. But if you know Larry and you know people who know Larry, I'm sure they would tell you that the most important and meaningful part of his career is the people he has mentored along the journey. There are literally hundreds of them out there in our business. They're doing great work, and all of them have been taught or inspired by Larry Kramer. Anyone who says you can't get rich in this business needs to look at Larry's legacy, not his bank account. That legacy lies in the power and the depth of the people he has helped over the years across his own illustrious career. That is something we should all aspire to. That is distinguished achievement, the way we see it here at SABU, and it is my honor and privilege to present you, Larry, with SABU's Distinguished Achievement Award for 2022. It is so well deserved. Come on up and get it. Please have a seat. Put that on the table right here so people can see that. Ryan, come on up. Ryan, don't knock that over. So one of Larry's disciples is here to interview him. Brian Sozzi is an anchor at Yahoo Finance and the former editor of TheStreet.com. He's also one of the brightest stars in our business and will likely be honored up here on this stage one day too. Brian, take it away.
Oh, don't make me tear up, Caleb. What are you doing?
Me too.
Holy cow, man. I was starting to tear up when you were introducing him. Well, this is a tremendous. I am so happy for you, Larry. I can't even go into words. But I had a whole anecdote planned on here, and if I learned anything from you, it's to not bury the lead. So my first question to you is, how did you get here?
Good question. I started in journalism really young. I was a delivery boy for an afternoon newspaper. You remember afternoon newspapers? Or,
sort of.
You actually remember newspapers? Or, yeah. We I knew from the time I was a delivery boy, that's what I wanted to be in that business. I was at a junior high school in Hackensack, New Jersey, and I had split session. I'd get out of school at noon, and I had to kill time before my route, which was at 3 in the afternoon. The newspaper was 2 doors away from the school, so I'd walk over to the newspaper and hang out because I could go with the truck that took my papers home, and I could pocket my bus money. It was early entrepreneurism, actually. And so I did that, and I fell in love with hanging around the newsroom on deadline, and just knew that was what I wanted to do. I went to college. I went to high school and was an editor of the paper there and college. And I got business journalism came later to me while I was in college. I'd been a journalist, and I was studying to be a journalist, ready to be a reporter, and I had to write an article for a magazine article writing class at Syracuse. And you had to try and sell it. That was the idea here, try to freelance a piece. Mm-hmm. So I wrote about one of the few things I actually knew about at college, which was the grass and hash business at Syracuse University. It was a hashish. I'll explain it to you later.
As always, ahead of your time.
Yes, thank you. It was 50 years ago. And I wrote this piece. I got a B+ on it, which upset me to no end. So I was even more determined to sell it. And I sent it to a bunch of places, and Fortune called me. And I got a phone call from an AME at Fortune who said, we like this piece. Can you come down here? We want to talk about it. I went down and I wrote, I worked with them and edited it, and they bought the piece. And they paid me $2,500, which was second half of the year tuition at Syracuse. And I said, this is a great business. I love this. It's my first business story. And they published it. It was they did put 2 pages of Fortune then. It was a big magazine then. It was physically bigger. And they said, they identified me as, at 21, they said I was the youngest author ever to have a byline in Fortune. It said on there. Actually, at first it said, I saw the editing notes, and it said, at 21, he's possibly the youngest author ever in Fortune. And the editor had circled it in red and said, we ought to know. And so that was my first editing experience. And they found out, and I was. So 2 weeks later at college, the story came out. And I got a phone call from Jan Wenner, who you may remember the name. He was, at the time, the founding editor of Rolling Stone in San Francisco, which was only a couple of years old. And he said, we love that piece. We want to run it. And I said, well, Fortune owns it, and you have to talk to them. So he called them up, and they said, yeah, you can run it, but you got to pay Larry Kramer $2,500, because we did. So that was my first semester tuition for the next year.
I think they pay a penny a word now, so you made out okay.
I did all right, and I said, this business thing is pretty good, both writing about it and working it. So I decided to go to Harvard Business School right out of college, out of journalism school, to learn more about business. And if you remember the early 70s, it was Watergate, and the big stories were follow the money. And so this is what my way of becoming an investigative reporter was, to learn business, because that seemed to be where the money was. From that point on, I had a real great interest in business. Even though I went on to be a reporter and editor in general news first, I did become a business reporter at the Washington Post, and I did spend a lot of time building businesses. And the Harvard education and contacts helped me become a manager and helped me start MarketWatch.
I hear, were you a photographer at Woodstock?
Yeah, so I got a...
I do my work.
That's going even further back. So now we're at 51 years back.
Okay.
I was a freshman at Syracuse, and there are 2 anecdotes that lead me to this. I'm sorry to take so much of your time.
Go for it.
One of them is, I was sitting at the desk at city desk at the Daily Orange, our newspaper. Phone rings, and it's the AP, and they want to know if we had a reporter who could go cover something at Cornell, which is about 40 minutes away. Of course, they couldn't find their Cornell stringer. So I had a car, which was the operative thing, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. So I went down, and this is a lesson in always take the call. So I went down there, and the story was that then they called them the Black Student Union, had taken over the Cornell's administration building, and nobody knew what was going on or why. And they said they were sending a photographer from Albany to meet me. So I went down there and met the photographer. We waited and waited. They never came out of the building, and we were about to leave. And then as this, it was getting dark, and the photographer said, I'm going, I said, look, stay another half hour. We got a half hour of light. And about 10 minutes later, the door opened up, and they walked out, and they were holding automatic weapons, and they had a bandana of bullets on them. Nobody knew they were armed. And he started shooting pictures. There was nobody else there. Most of the media had gone. So I got a pretty good story out of it for the AP, but he won the Pulitzer Prize for the photos. And when they accepted the prize, which was the following May, I got a call from he told us that story. And his boss said, find me that kid. And so they called me and offered me a summer job at AP. So I went to AP for that summer, which was the summer of '69, to learn how to be a photo editor. And they liked that I wasn't a photographer, because they wanted desk editors to understand how the big stories were, what were the big stories. And all summer, all the young photographers were teaching me how to take pictures and loaning me their cameras. And I kept saying, let me cover something, let me cover something. End of August came by, and the last thing left that they finally let me do was to go cover this music festival that they thought wasn't a story in upstate New York. So I went up there and got a hotel room. I got it early in the summer because I was going to go anyway. These are my favorite groups. And sure enough, I drive up early. Rain starts to happen. The history of Woodstock. And I get out. I take one picture of them, people coming down the road, just 1 million people coming down the road. And I hopped on it's a longer story, but I won't tell it, hopped on a helicopter that was bringing the bands in and out. and got a aerial shot. And it was Thursday afternoon. I put those 2 shots onto the AP network from my hotel room. I learned how I developed them, and I did all the work of editing them and do all that. Wrote the captions, put them on, and they were used all over the world, and because they were the only pictures out until Friday, and got me a permanent job if I wanted it at the AP, and the centerfold of life. The first 8 big pictures I ever shot were the centerfold of life.
You've worked with titans in this industry, titan after titan. Who was your first titan that you worked with, and what did you learn from them, and why do you think you got to work with them?
Wow. Well, it started when I was a young reporter at San Francisco. My first job after Harvard was be a reporter there, and I worked with William Randolph Hearst III as a reporter. His father was Randolph Hearst, who was the publisher of the Examiner, who was a terrific guy, and he really was trying to change the paper and make it younger in the history. It was the 100th anniversary of when they founded the Examiner. His great-grandfather his grandfather rather founded the Examiner. And Will was just a wonderful guy and easy to work with. And we were both, I left a few years later to go to the Washington Post. He left to start something, and 10 years later, we got back together again, and he was actually my boss. He became publisher of the Examiner, and he hired me to be editor. And so we were, 2 kids, still young then, running a major metropolitan newspaper, which was exciting and fun. At the Washington Post, I had gotten to know my boss. My first boss was Ben Bradley, and he was absolutely tremendous. And his, Ben's magic was he was just so straightforward and so honest and easy to talk to, and just no bullshit kind of guy. He'd tell you the way it was. Didn't matter, and he was very charismatic. And so the newsroom would just rally around him for anything, and he was wonderful. Then. Later, they sent me up to New Jersey to run a newspaper there for them, the Trenton Times. And I really, technically, because there was no division for newspapers, they had only owned 1 or 2 others besides the Washington Post, I reported to Katharine Graham, who was amazing. And I used to go up and sit next to her sometimes when she would give speeches. And she was petrified. Every time she had to give a speech, she would just be shaking. But she'd get up and deliver these inspiring speeches that people just loved. And then sit down. The first thing she would say is, how'd I do? And she was so nervous about it. And I watched that a lot in her. She would go to a board meeting, or a meeting with her vice presidents, and she'd have this idea that was a great idea. And she'd ask what they all thought. And they all felt like they had to say something. And frequently they didn't like the idea, or they'd say, well, here's what it's dangerous because, same stories you heard about Watergate and about Pentagon Papers, where the business side would tell her, you're putting the paper in danger, you're doing stuff. And every time she stuck with her decision, it was the right one. And sometimes she get talked out of it, and she shouldn't have. But watching somebody so insecure grow and become such a powerful leader was really exciting and really interesting. So those were some, the early ones that, then... God, I'm probably leaving a few out.
Marshall Loeb.
Well, Marshall, when I was a summer intern at Syracuse, between Syracuse and my grad school at Harvard, I went to work for Time here in New York. They weren't in these lavish offices then, but they were up in the Time Life building on 6th Avenue. Marshall was the business editor of Time, so I worked in his department. I was the summer intern in his department. Amazing guy. Those are the days when they had a trolley to go to every office on Friday afternoons or Thursday and Friday afternoons with booze. And I remember sitting in one of the editor's offices and he had this like college mug, those big ceramic college mugs, filled to the brim with one ice cube floating. And I was looking at it longingly. I didn't know what it was. And he said, oh, you want a drink? Go ahead. I thought it was like a Coke. It was scotch. And this was like early in the day. And these guys would just, Anyway, Marshall was a wonderful teacher and a wonderful guy. And I had the joy in Marshall's case of many, many years later when we founded MarketWatch of hiring him back. He was retiring then. And was clearly a little nervous about being bored. And I had lunch with him, and I said, you should come to work for us. And we kind of we made up a title for him, like Senior Editor Emeritus or something great, worthy of his name. And he was the hardest working guy in the newsroom. He would do radio, TV, and print. He was the only person we had who actually produced for all three almost every day. And it was just an inspiration to watch him work. He was great.
And I want to get to MarketWatch because that's when I first really became familiar with you and what you achieved. Before all of that, there was a World Series in California, and there was an earthquake.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about that.
That was great, yeah. Well, my family's here, and my son particularly remembers that. He was, God, how old were you then? You were 4 or 5? Yeah, 7. Oh, my God. Yeah, it was 89. He stayed home, but we went to the game with friends of ours. My wife and I went to the game, and we were sitting in like the 7th row, and it was just a couple minutes before the game. It was like 5 o'clock, dusk. And I was looking up, and an unusual thing was happening. You know those big light poles with all the lights and they turn them on. They used to turn the lights on around 4 or 5 because it was colored TV, and they wanted to light up the field even more than daytime. But they were swinging and popping. Lights were popping out and breaking. And I said, something wrong is happening here. And before we knew it, all those lights went out. It was daytime, so nobody was scared, but people were kind of, what's going on? The game hadn't started. The announcers couldn't announce anything. People were walking out in the street. So I went to, I decided I better get my ass back to the paper. I was editor of the paper, and my managing editor was sitting, behind me a few rows back, and he looked at each other and said, "Oh my God," So I had to. My wife went home. My wife and I and our friends. I wasn't driving. Our friend was driving. He drove me through the city to drop me off, so I could get as close to the paper as I could. And they went back to where we lived in Marin County, which was north of the city, and the. I had to flag a car to go in, but all the cars were coming out of the city. So the only car coming in, there was this Volkswagen coming at me. It was kind of a puff of smoke on the inside of it. And I kind of waved him down. The guy opened the door, and the guy said, "Where you going, man?" I said, "I'm going downtown. Do you going?" "Yeah, sure. I got to pick up my wife, He had the Grateful Dead blasting. He was totally stoned. And going in the wrong direction to everybody else. So I said, sure, why not? What could possibly go wrong?
Looks good.
He looks good. So he drove me down there, and he got me there. And I walked into the paper, and there were 500 people standing around outside, nobody knowing what to do because we had no power. And we literally strung an extension cord across the road, downtown San Francisco Road, over some trees and into the next building, which was a Crocker Bank data center, which had backup power. And we plugged it into their lobby with their permission and ran a newspaper with that line.
And the papers got out.
Papers got it. We kept plugging in different things to a big plug that came out of it that was on our end. And we would, we set the type by printing out long strips of type on Mac. We pasted it up in the paste up room. And then we powered up, we used the same cord to power up the one transmitter we had. We transmitted to a suburban plant and printed the paper. It was amazing.
It's amazing. Talk to us about your first leadership job.
Yeah, it was, so really the first serious one was Trenton. When the Post sent me to Trenton to be editor, they sent me up to be managing editor and ultimately editor of the Trenton Times. I was 29, I just turned 30 actually. And it was, an interesting situation. They had bought the paper a couple of years earlier, and they had a succession of editors who didn't work out. Some Washington Post editors who came, and they were competing with a local paper, another paper in town that was owned locally at the time. And they were getting, they were seen as the carpetbaggers. Frankly, the only reason the Washington Post asked me to do this and give me my first editing job was I was from New Jersey. That was their ace in the hole. We could send somebody up who, it was nowhere near Trenton. It didn't matter. I was a New Jersey resident. And they had tried just about everything else, right? And I went up, and Rick, who's here actually with me, was at the paper at the time. That's where I met Rick Levinson. And what was great about it was, the good news was what I didn't know. I just didn't know how scared I should be about, the situation, how much money we were losing, all that stuff. So we tried lots of stuff. We were entrepreneurial. I didn't feel like it was on me. There were low expectations. And the staff was this bright young staff that had come to the paper because they all wanted to get to the Washington Post, which owned it. But the other editors were trying to get them to be local journalists and weren't all that interested in moving them onto the Post. They saw me as the way in, I think, so they rallied around me, and they were great. And we had 2 or 3 really fantastic editors. Rick, a guy named Rem Ryder, who's the Metro editor, and we all put it together, and we turned the paper around, and in a year and a half, we went from afternoon to morning. We did a bunch of things, and we were making money. So that was the good news. The bad news was, as soon as it started making money, they got a couple offers for the paper and sold it immediately.
Like always.
And they sold it to a guy who later built up Media News, and it was an interesting. Wasn't a great sale for the paper itself. It was good for the Post because they could get out of. They just lost their appetite for running local newspapers. And I got to go back to the Post, and that's when I became assistant managing editor at the Post.
I'll fast forward a little bit. I'm generally fascinated how you founded MarketWatch when there really was no internet.
Right. Well, we started the idea for MarketWatch when online stuff started happening. Remember Prodigy? You probably don't remember.
I do.
You read about Prodigy.
I got discs for my computer.
Right,
Yes,
that's right.
yes.
AOL and Prodigy were starting to do their things, and we all said, this is going to be, if you could actually see the market fairly instantly, close to instantly, you could start buying and selling stocks yourself. In those days, you bought and sold stocks through brokers. Brokers were wired. They had the Telerate, or they had even Bloomberg was just started, but Reuters terminals. There were all these terminals that brokers had, but the general public wasn't going to pay $2,000 or $3,000 a month for a terminal. So they weren't trading themselves that much. They would always trade through brokers. Day trading hadn't really started. It was just starting because as suddenly you could go to your CompuServe or Prodigy account and see your stocks in near real time. It wasn't quite real time. But I thought that there was going to be an opportunity in that world. Then the internet started to come along as we were fashioning this idea of doing it. We were doing it with sports and business. Those were the 2 areas we thought real time mattered. And when the brokerages started offering real time trading cheap, and the internet started to wake up, things started to happen on the internet. All of a sudden, I realized there'd be a big opening. If somebody could actually trade by themselves sitting at home, they'd want to do that rather than deal with brokers, because a lot of the brokers were pushing things to them that they didn't really know that they didn't need, but they were products the brokers were supposed to sell, right? And they just didn't. There wasn't a high trust in brokers at the time, and people wanted to trade their own, and suddenly they could have access to the real-time information. Now, the only people covering the news in real time were Reuters, Dow Jones, Bloomberg. Basically, that was it. I mean, CBS had one financial news reporter, a guy named Ray Brady, who covered TV and radio for CBS News. I mean, that's what was going on. But you also saw the beginning of these financial news networks. FNN was there, CNBC had started. So there was this interest in real time. Suddenly, the ability to bring real time to somebody at home was there. The news guys couldn't afford to put their news on a real time thing because they're putting it on terminals where they're charging $2,000 a month. So they're not going to be able to do it for free because they don't want to lose that business. So when I looked at what people were reading for real-time news, I said, we could really replicate a lot of this with a small newsroom. And knowing news and knowing how it worked really helped me. And understanding that I could hire half a dozen reporters. And the way we picked what we covered, the way we hired reporters as soon as we could afford them when we started, was based on what stocks were traded by basically day traders. What were their favorite stocks? They were all mostly not internet tech stocks. And so I'd hire somebody and say, you're covering AOL, you're covering Yahoo. And as these businesses would come up, Netscape was huge at the time. And it turned out, you knew if you were a journalist that your reporter could be just as good as the Dow Jones reporter if you had 1 against 1. if you hired the right person. And I hired people from Reuters and from Bloomberg and, that were good reporters. And so it was very quickly obvious that our news was as fast as everybody else's, and you could get it at home without having to go through a brokerage or do that.
How did your family let you do this? Because this sounds like a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week thing.
There is a funny moment about how I actually got into it, though. When I had decided to do this, I was in San Francisco, and I was editor of the Examiner. But I had the bug about Silicon Valley. And I was going to leave the newspaper business because it was going downhill at that point. And I was an afternoon newspaper editor. And I went, I had this discussion with my family about the possibility. We had this beautiful home in Tiburon, just north of San Francisco in Marin County. And so we sat out on the deck and kind of talked about, what do we want to do here in life? And I sort of raised the possibility that I might leave the newspaper job. And the alternatives were I could move to another media job in New York or Atlanta. I had possibilities in both places. Or I could go to do this startup. And
you had a lot of offers, too.
Yeah. I had pretty good, in the industry, I had some pretty good ones. But at this moment, I was pretty excited about the idea of starting a business, right? And I was, I was 40 around then. It was not, I wasn't a spry chicken at that point. And it was nerve-wracking about what would happen from, owning this expensive house with a big mortgage. What would happen if it didn't work out? There was that possibility. And basically, the family was, very supportive of me, except the way they put it, I said, well, what do you think? Should we move to New York or Atlanta or take a chance and stay here? And, they kind of huddled and sent me off the deck, returned me back, and said, we've decided you should take the job you want. And if it's in New York or Atlanta, we'll see on weekends.
Nice.
So basically, my choice was made up for me. That you need a supportive family if you're going to have a family and become an entrepreneur. You're right, but it actually you're really in control of your time. So if I wanted to go to a little league game or coach basketball for Erica's team or something, I could do that.
What was the road show like?
The road show was the closest I'll ever feel to being a rock star. It was right in the heart of the internet. It was the first roadshow of 1999, first IPO of 99. And we had decided we would go out at between $10 and $12 a share. We were raising $20 million. We were going to raise $17 million. I forgot, something small like that. But we would be public. And it was, we were selling 20% of the company for almost $20 million. So it was valuing the company at $100 million. But we only had $7 million in sales, and we were basically break-even business. But the internet was so crazy then. And our customers were all the traders. They wanted this stock badly. They loved the site, and they wanted to own part of it. So first week, road shows in those days, you'd do like 70 in a week. You'd go to a town, have limousines, it'd take you 45 minutes, just like this, only you'd get 45 minutes to tell your story at some big, fancy hedge fund, and then you'd have to go to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. At the end of the first week, the bankers, we had a bunch of bankers, said, well, we've checked with everybody you went to, and they all want in, and they all want the most shares they could possibly get. We were selling, like I said, about 20 million shares. We had institutional orders for, at that point, 50 million shares. And I said, well, we're not going to, they said, just do it another week. Let's raise the price. We'll go, instead of 10 to 12, we'll go 12 to 14. So we put on 12 to 14. We had to go back to everybody. They said, no, we're still in. And then we went another week, and the same thing happened. So now we had institutional orders for 100 million shares, and we were selling 20 million shares. I said, this is ridiculous. And they said, they wanted me to go to Europe for the third week. And I said, no, I'm not going to Europe. We're going to do this right now. And they said, okay, well, I said, well, we ought to charge like $30 a share. I mean, we can get, they said, no, you can't do that. And they explained to me how analysts work and how they had to have, you had to ultimately be able to defend whatever price you put out there as being real. And you had to use these indicators. And among the indicators then, they were stretching. It was like forward-looking numbers for Yahoo for the next year, how we were projecting our growth. It was so bizarre, I can't begin to tell you. So we negotiated with the analysts for these 4 or 5 of the banks that were on our cover, and we came up with $17 a share. So now we're 70% more than we were worth 2 weeks earlier. We take it public the next day, and we're sitting all at MarketWatch, sitting around the one terminal we had, of one real terminal we had, like a Bloomberg, waiting to see what the first share traded at. First half hour goes by, nothing, no trades. Second, we're up into the third hour of market and it hasn't opened yet. So I call NASDAQ, say, what gives? They said, we have a order imbalance problem. And I said, what's an order imbalance problem? He said, we have a lot of buyers and nobody's selling. And I said, well, what do you do about that? He said, well, we're talking to all the funds that have bought, and we think we're going to open up some stock soon. And so sit tight. A half hour before the market closed, the first share went across time and sales at 65. And I said, oh my God. And then it was a blur, and you couldn't read it because things were trading so fast. And then about 5 minutes in, it froze because the machine froze, and it was at 85. And it hit 129, and it came back in the last 2 minutes to 97. What had happened, though, is when it hit 100, the market cap of the company became $1 billion. And all of the funds that bought us were all microcaps. And it triggered them selling. So they all sold and made 7 times their money in 30 minutes. And we wound up, with a $1 billion company, which stayed roughly at that level for a year and a half until the market crash, the internet market crash of 2000 and 2001.
Well, Mark,
it was an amazing day.
I could talk all day about this. That is absolutely fascinating. But I think, as Kayla mentioned too, switching gears to mentoring and talent. I had the pleasure of working with you at TheStreet. I mean, I think what you did there was absolutely phenomenal. But chief among them, it was mentoring talent. And there are just hundreds of folks like me that absolutely love you and will do anything for you if we could. How do you spot talent, and how have you helped grow talent?
Can I borrow some money from you? It's both easier and harder than you think. The easy part is you really do have to talk to people, and you really do have to listen to people. And some of it is, some of it is just the way a person is. Are they willing to hear you out? Are they willing to learn? Do they appreciate what you want to give them? And if they are, and there are a whole lot of people in this organization who have worked for me at different times, and by and large, those are the best people who really know they have something to learn and want to learn, and are willing to listen and hear that it might not be the way they think it is, and that's okay, but they're hungry. There are instincts involved too, and I remember when I went to the Washington Post and I got hired at the Washington Post during Watergate. I said, you guys, you could have hired anybody. You had all these applicants from all over the country, and why me? And the business editor of the Post who hired me, a guy named Peter Silverman, said, I've looked at everything you've done, and I really was fascinated by one particular thing, which is you just have this habit of landing feet first in the middle of big stories. Starting with Woodstock and just things that, you had a sense they were there. You went after them even though it wasn't clear what the story would be. And they turned out to be a big story, and you only got it because you put yourself in position to get it. So you need the breaks, there's no question. And the breaks can be something like just a boss who cares about you. But you also need to be hungry and be willing to try things and take it. If you believe in something, at least test it. And so people who, I like people who are industrious, who had ideas, and who would argue with you. Argue with me if I came up. And one of the first people I hired at the Washington Post was an intern, Kara Swisher.
Good hire.
Kara was at Georgetown, and I was the Metro editor. And we had a story about the Georgetown provost. It was a 6-inch story inside the Metro section. I get a call, and I said, yeah, and I said, Larry Kramer. She goes, who are you? And I said, well, you called me. And she said, no, how important are you? I said, I don't know, I'm in charge of local news. She goes, good. She goes, you guys suck. I said, what are you talking about? And now you know who she is, you know that's how she talks. And she said, you guys did a 7-inch story on the provost of Georgetown, and you made 6 mistakes. And I said, I could do a better job than you. And I said, well, who are you? I said, I'm a student at Georgetown. I said, well, come down here and we'll talk about it. And she came. About an hour later, she just got through security, and there she was, face pressed against the glass door. I had a glass office at the Post. So she came in, told me everything we were doing wrong over the past 5 years, and I had a great conversation with her. I said, you're hired. You're an intern. And she was like, she didn't know what to say. But she was the right person at the right time, and she's exactly the same way now that she was then. And we're friends, and we've stayed friends, but I've watched her grow.
Quickly, one more thing that I think ties you, at least to things that I've seen, the master of the turnaround. I don't think a lot of folks know here, some probably do, but you're, I would say, the father of the modern day USA Today. Yeah. You turned TheStreet around. How have you been able to do this? Time after time.
Yeah, I like doing turnarounds again because it's part of the nature of being underestimated. My golf game is better because people think I'm really bad, and I'm actually just bad. and low expectations matter, and it gives you a great basis to come up. When you go to a great place that's already great, like the New York Times, the biggest lesson a reporter has to learn is it doesn't get easier. The people, you write a story, and the arguments over what you're going to say or what you're saying in that story go to a whole higher level than they were at the last place you were. And you're sitting there thinking, I'm at the New York Times. I'm pretty good now. I shouldn't be going through this. And no, you're at the New York Times, and you're going to be going through this, and that's why it's the New York Times, right? So getting from a place that didn't do enough of that to a place that did is fun. Because the arguments are all about good things. The fights were, wait, why do we do that? Half the problems are things they did because that's how they always did them. And nobody stopped to think about why they did them or how it affected the reader. One of the magic things about a journalist, if you're going to be a great journalist, and you're going to interview people, the most important thing to know is to know what they're trying to get out of that interview. And so you can add what they're trying to get out of the relationship you have with a source, let's say. So you can speak to them, or if you're negotiating with somebody, or it's the same thing in business, know what the other guy wants. Know what, and in this case of a publication or a digital print, whatever, understand what the readers want. And it isn't one reader. There's lots of different readers, and different readers want different things. But if you really understand what's interesting about them and what they're interested in, and you focus on that and not what you like doing or what's easy for you to do, you can score a lot of points with them. So just putting stories on the front page that they're interested in got people more interested in USA Today. Put digitally, delivering it to them over phones and every single device you could, which was not what they were doing when I got there, made a big difference because that was a way to reach them. Despite the fact that you could tell them until you're blue in the face, it's much easier to read in print. They weren't going to read it in print. You were going to have to and you were going to have to put your best foot forward digitally. Look at what newspapers did for years. When they went digital, they'd hold stories for the print paper and, publish it and then go, and,
I think they still do that in some places.
Not many, I hope, but not many. But if you look at the New York Times, even the New York Times, and what's happened to the New York Times and the Washington Post in the last several years, was they took a tough situation, which was Trump becoming president, digitalization coming fast, all these things, put them together and said, well, we're going to go after all these things together. And instead of holding stories for the paper, and they were amongst the last who gave that up, they started publishing their stories on the cycle of television news shows. So they could break it on, Rachel Maddow, or they would break a story then in exchange for Rachel putting on one of their reporters on the air to say, there's breaking news in the New York Times, and we have the reporter that's doing it, here it is. And that did more for them and their reputation than holding it for the next day and hoping that they're still going to break that story in the morning. they learned how to use the other medium. They were using it more for promotion then, but that's how they became part of that medium too. And so understanding that it's not about being a newspaper or TV news operation or a radio operation anymore, or even a podcast, it's about producing content that people want and then understanding where they want to get it. And it's changing. So it was just being able to see the early exposure I had to digital really helped me understand that people's habits were going to change. And stopping people from doing things that they were doing that were really good for them but not good for the reader. That's as simple as that sounds, it's not easy.
It's not. Well, on to here, I'll just say that I personally owe my career to you. And there are a lot of other folks maybe out there and just in the world of business news and news that will echo my sentiment. This is an incredibly deserved honor, really. Had to.
Thanks, Ryan.
Questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Myron Candell, formerly of CNN.
Myron, hi.
Larry, this room is filled with very bright people who are either managers or are going to be managers someday. What are the 3 pieces of advice you have to be a successful leader in journalism?
Wow. Well, one of them is definitely take chances. Because you're really, if you're taking a management job in journalism today, you have to be an entrepreneur, because you're really going into new worlds. It's still going to be like that for a while. So I think don't be afraid to take chances is one of them. I do think betting on people early and giving them a chance to prove themselves for you. You can't do this alone. You can't run a business alone. And this is going to sound contradictory, but the first one is, give people running room, give them a lot of running room, do it. And the second one is, if it's not working out, make a change. As a manager, the hardest thing for me, and not all managers, but for me, the hardest thing was to finally say somebody isn't doing their job, and I got to make a change. And invariably, what you'd think of, and the nicer you are as a person, the worse this becomes, is you really want it to work for that person. So instead of saying, we got to try somebody else here, you keep trying to make it work with that person. You try and teach them, you try and do what you can, and they get in deeper and deeper, and it makes running it more problematic. So the biggest regret I have, if I have one going back through all the years, is that I may not have made changes as fast as I should have. And the reason it doesn't work for somebody isn't that they're good or bad. It's just a fit thing, when we started MarketWatch, I had 6 or 8 people reporting to me, advertising and the newsroom and different people. And as we got bigger and we grew very quickly, it was clear that some of them were growing with the job, but some of them weren't. If you were in sales, the fact that you were a great salesperson wasn't the same as that you ran a great sales staff when it became 40 people. They were just different skill sets. So, building a team up and giving them a lot of running room, but also recognizing if it's not working are really important things you have to take advantage of. Plus, you have to really, I think, do. And the other one is listen. There's a lot of people in the business you probably can talk to, and when you have a problem, ask them and listen to what their experience has been in it, because it's hard to find people with a lot of experience in the media, because the media's changed so much every 5 or 10 years in the last few decades. So the experience that people in front of you have had is different than the one you're walking into. So it takes a lot of pieces of learning from one side to the other. And the last thing is the audience. Make sure you really understand who your audience is and how they want to read you. Because and we can do that now. A huge percentage of the New York Times newsroom are people that work on an audience now. They're not journalists per se, but they're people who are studying the actual your customers, and it's important to mine what data you can get out of those customers and what their habits are. Pay attention to it, because they may not be your habits, and you really need to understand theirs. Those are just some of the quick hits. Good to see you, Marty.
Diane King Hall. I work for CBS, and most of my time there has been for MoneyWatch, which is the artist formerly known as MarketWatch.
Right.
So this is a little bit of an inside baseball question here. MarketWatch, what I've gleaned in CBS ended, I guess, or it broke up, split up in 2005.
Yes.
Why? What happened? I'm sure the simple answer is money.
I know you'll find this hard to believe, but it comes down to money.
I had a feel. I was like, money, but could I have a broader
we had a
explanation?
wonderful relationship with CBS. And one of the reasons we were able to do and one of the reasons I went to CBS when we founded MarketWatch to be our partner was they didn't have financial news coverage at the time. They only had Sky Ray Brady, basically. And I met with Andrew Hayward, who was then the president of CBS News, a wonderful man. And I did this big pitch for him about why we should cover business news for CBS. We're this web guys, but guess what? I came out of print, and I know serious business news, and I'll make sure the guys I've hired and the women I've hired are from Reuters and from, they're really good journalists. You could have 30 journalists, and you're up against, at that point, CNBC, and NBC had CNBC, right? And I made this big pitch, and I knew one of two things was going to happen. Because I've been in those meetings when I was at the Washington Post where people would come in and say, we'll cover this for you. And the window wasn't big enough to throw them out of. We said, you can't cover this for us. We're the Washington Post. And I said, CBS could easily do that, which is kind of what NBC did when we approached them about possibly doing, we can handle that for you. And I said, no, we can handle it for you. And CBS based, and Andrew said that would be wonderful. And he was just open to the idea. So it took us a month or two of negotiation. And CBS had never let anyone else use the I. And a company that wasn't fully owned by CBS could not use the I. And I say that because it's a great example of what it means to try and work with a big corporation. We had the I police on us all the time. We would do stationery that would have a green CBS I on it. You can't do this in green? We get the phone call, 3 lawyers would show up in our offices saying, once we went on the internet, God forsake, we had the I blink once. You would have thought we had invaded the Ukraine. And it was just insane. So the idea that there were a couple of people there who could work together really created something beautiful. CBS grew to love MarketWatch, and they gave us a show. We had a weekend show, and we did all kinds of stuff there. And we were feeding them people. One of the first interns I hired was Poppy Harlow, and Poppy was right out of Columbia. And we put her on, we had her do producing and then ultimately go on the air for MarketWatch. And CBS immediately started grabbing her and using her for, NewsPath and for some of the other stuff they were doing. And we had lots of employees like that who they really favored and they used. And I said I would hire TV journalists. At that point on, I said I'll hire TV journalists for our show, but I'll let you approve them so that I can be sure you'll put them on your air, that they're up to your standards. We really worked it out, and things were going really well. That what changed things up was, the corporate side was at the time was kind of cheap, and their idea, they loved being in the internet with us because it didn't cost them anything. We gave them 45% of the company when we founded the company, not for cash, but for $50 million worth of promotion on the CBS network and for the right to use the I and to be part of CBS. So my salespeople and my journalists could say they were CBS MarketWatch people, which I knew would get them in the door. And it did. And it was a great relationship. Then about 5 years later, 7 years later, Dow Jones came to us, and the company was on a great heading, doing well, and they said, we have to own this. Dow Jones had made the decision. Some of you who work there will really be fascinated by this. They did research where they looked at their audience and asked, where do you get your financial news? Who does the best financial news? Where do you get it? And they had 5 or 6 categories of people, or maybe it was 8 categories of people who profiles, they called them. And the audiences, every year they'd ask those groups the same question. Every year they get the same answer, and it was always them. One of their, it might be Barron's or it might be Wall Street Journal, but it was a Dow Jones business. In 2004, when they did that research, in 2 categories, the answer came back MarketWatch, of where do you get your news. One of them was college students, and the other one was self-directed investors, day traders. The people who were crazily trading on the web then, they said, well, we get MarketWatch. We don't use you, or we barely use it. And at a big event in San Francisco, it was, I can't remember if it was the newspaper editors, but it was a big media event. Warren Buffett was the speaker. And I knew, because I was on a panel next, and I was sitting there waiting to go on, and somebody in the audience asked him, well, where do you get your financial news? And he said, MarketWatch. At which point, all my buddies who were in the newspaper business looked at me and said, oh boy, we made a mistake. So they knew they had to get it. And they started after us. And we got smart bankers, and we said, look, we don't want to put it for sale. We don't want to market it for sale, but these guys, there is a number which if they'll pay enough, we'll sell it. Because I have to. We're a publicly traded company at that point. And MarketWatch, and so they 5 different companies bid on us. It was the bankers. What they did was they secretly went to all the people we thought might be interested, and everybody they went to said yes, we're interested, and they all came in a quiet. It hadn't been public until the day or two before we actually made the sale. That Dow Jones was in, CBS was in, Yahoo was in, Gannett was in. And I'm trying to remember who the 5th was. New York Times. And we had made different pitches to all of them about what it was worth to them. For the New York Times, it was about competing with the Journal. There were lots of things about that they wanted. For the Journal, it was about a lot of things, including we had a big business of licensing our content to other places that they had a similar business. So they understand all of our revenue, not just the advertising that was going on. And they wanted our advertising revenue badly because they wanted to show that they could sell a lot of advertising on the web. And because they were charging for the Wall Street Journal on the web at the time, they weren't getting a lot of page views. And so we would represent a lot of page views. They could put them two together, sell a lot, and make a lot and keep charging for Wall Street Journal. So they all had their own reasons. But it technically was worth more to Dow Jones than anybody because they understood every piece of our business. The bidding war went on, and we were, at that time, $10 a share. This was much later. We had a lot more shares out, so we were worth a lot more. And they bid it up to 18. And CBS lost it in the very last round to Dow Jones. And they were freaked when they lost it. But we sold for $520 million. So it was not something we could walk away from. And the CBS people were very upset. They thought they were going to get it. Les Moonves was there, and but they couldn't outbid them because it really was worth more to Dow Jones than to them.
We're going to have to break here because we do have lunch out there. But I know, Larry, if you can stick around a couple more minutes, people did have a few more questions. I know they want to maybe pick your brain before you head back up to Syracuse. And thank you to Larry's family for showing up. Again, it's our honor to honor Larry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Brian, thank you. Great interview. We do have lunch upstairs and outside, just like yesterday, but we're going to come right back in this room at 1:15. Larry, we need you up here, and Brian for a few photos. Myron Kendall, if you can come down, that would be great too. And if you have questions for Larry, you can stick around, and maybe he can answer a few before he goes. Thank you so much.